Welcome to the History and Heritage podcast with me, Liam Blake. Join me as we uncover hidden stories and insights that shaped our world. From mysteries to legacies, join us on this journey through time. The history of the horse is the history of human civilization. So that was a quote about horses by Professor James Serpell of the University of Pennsylvania. As you will have guessed, this episode is about a horse breed. When we think of the great animals of Irish history, our minds might turn to the elegant Connemara pony, the noble Irish wolfhound, or perhaps even the mythic Lia Macha, the grey steed of Cuchulainn. But for over 2 centuries, no animal was more central to the daily rhythm of life in Ireland, especially for the rural poor and the Irish traveller community, than the humble, hard-working and often overlooked Irish Cob. This isn't the story of a warhorse or a sporting champion. This is the story of a horse that never charged into battle or won ribbons in glossy show rings. It's the story of a workhorse, in the truest and most literal sense of the word. The Irish Cob pulled ploughs and carts and traps. It carried turf from the bog and bread from the bakery. It delivered midwives to cottages, tinsmiths to villages, and children to school. It brought families to mass on Sundays after a week's work pulling barrows and wagons through rain and muck. It grazed where cattle wouldn't, stood tied quietly at gates of fairs and funerals, and served in silence and strength. This is the story of the Irish Cob, not merely a breed, but a living emblem of how the vast majority of Irish people once lived, worked and moved. The origins of the Irish Cob lie not in grandeur but in necessity. The type began to take shape in the 18th and 19th centuries, born from a world where horses were not pets or symbols, but tools of endurance and economy. There were no written pedigrees, no stud books. Farmers and labourers bred the horses they needed. Farmers and labourers bred the horses they needed, not the horses they could brag about. Sturdy Irish draft mares were crossed with heavier British breeds, particularly Clydesdales and Shires, and often with smaller, tougher ponies like the Fell and the Dales. The goal was simple: create an animal that could pull, plough, and persist. Selection was based not on beauty or fashion, but on temperament, strength, sure-footedness, and a willingness to work long hours with little complaint. What emerged over time was a cob of great physical substance, compact yet muscular, with a thick neck, strong hindquarters, abundant feathering on the legs, and a kind, often intelligent eye. They came in all colours, but the most iconic image today remains the piebald or skewbald cob. Black and white or brown and white, standing steady on the edge of a fairground, ears flicking, awaiting the next instruction. By the middle of the 19th century, these horses, though still without a name, could be found all over Ireland. Their heyday began in the aftermath of the Great Famine and lasted into the 1950s. In both town and countryside they were indispensable. In urban Ireland, cobs hauled milk, coal, bread and parcels. In rural Ireland, they were the smallholders and the turf cutters' closest allies. They were also the horse of choice for tinsmiths, travelling tradesmen, and above all for the Irish travelling community. Travellers played, and continue to play, an essential role in the preservation of the Irish Cob. For generations they relied on horses not just for transport, but for the livelihood and social standing. In their communities, the cob was more than a beast of burden. It was the source of pride, a teacher of patience and a signal of skill. Breeding knowledge, training techniques, and bloodlines were passed orally from parent to child through voice and practice, not paperwork. At the great horse fairs of Ireland, and none greater than Ballinasloe in County Galway, a family's reputation could rise or fall at the step of a good cob. A steady gait, calm temperament, and deep chest could tell you more than any stud book ever could. The Ballinasloe October Fair, which has been recorded as far back as 1722, became a centre not only of trade, but of tradition. Families returned year after year, horses tied in rows along laneways and ditches, smoke rising from the makeshift camps, children learning the ropes of how to walk, trot, and negotiate. These horses were judged not by their trophies, but by their utility. Could they pull? Could they pace? Could they keep calm in a crowd and still move with pride? One of the most fascinating aspects of the Irish Cob's story is that for the best part of its existence, it didn't even have a name. Unlike the Irish Draft, which received formal recognition in 1917, or the Connemara Pony, which had its stud book by 1926, the Irish Cob lived in the margins. It was often referred to simply as the common cob, the coloured cob, or just the working horse. Officialdom didn't record it, which meant its survival depended entirely on the communities who used and valued it. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the formal recognition was finally sought. A Limerick breeder, P.J. O'Connell, along with a handful of others, began campaigning to preserve the type. Their aim was not to reinvent it, but to protect it. They feared that as tractors replaced horses, as wealth moved people off the land and into cars, and as imported breeds with fashionable standards crowded out native stock, the old working cob would be lost. They lobbied the Department of Agriculture, set about establishing a breed standard, and recorded the horses they could find. After years of effort, the Irish Cob finally received full EU-level breed recognition in 2005, under Commission Decision 92-353 EEC, if you're interested. It was a long overdue acknowledgement, but by then the story had already begun to change. In the early 90s, across the Atlantic, an American businessman named Dennis Thompson encountered the same horses in the UK and became captivated. Enchanted by their look and their history, especially their association with Irish and Romani travellers, he began importing them to Florida in 1995. There he gave them a new name, the Gypsy Vanner. The rebrand came with sleek marketing, romanticised backstories, and a new breed registry. Almost overnight, horses that would have sold for a few €100 in rural Ireland were fetching tens of thousands of dollars in the United States. The irony was not lost on many in Ireland. Here was a horse shaped by poverty, bred for grit and not glamour, now being sold as an exotic high-end breed for wealthy enthusiasts abroad. But while the name might have changed, the horse hadn't. It was still the same steady, strong, and patient cob, still more at home pulling a sulky through a boreen than trotting around a Florida paddock. Meanwhile, back in Ireland, change was also coming. Urbanisation, new welfare regulations, and increasingly strict laws around animal control made it harder for the Irish traveller families and others to keep their horses in the way they had before. Smithfield Horse Fair in Dublin, which dates to at least the 1600s, began to come under pressure in the early 2000s. Eventually, it was curtailed by new city bylaws. All over the country, traditional horsekeeping became more difficult, more scrutinised, and in some places, actively discouraged. And yet, the Irish Cob remains. It remains not because it was rescued by regulation or branding, but because it still lives in the memory and the muscle of the people who value what it represents. You can still find them tied at the hedgerows of the Ballinasloe Fair every October. You'll still see them pacing down the back road in Longford or pulling a sulky near a halting site in Louth. Some are now show horses, clipped and polished, their feathers white and their manes braided. Many more still live lives of quiet utility, doing what they've always done, getting someone where they need to go, with patience and power. For the travelling community especially, the cob is far more than a horse. It is a cultural marker, a living link to generations past. It is a repository of oral knowledge, a subject of pride, and a source of identity. In a society that has long marginalised travellers and often misunderstood their traditions, the Irish Cob stands as a quiet counter-narrative, a proof of deep skill, deep knowledge, and a deep connection to the land, animal, and trade. Long before anyone cared about stud books or European recognition, they were the ones preserving the breed. What's remarkable is how much of Irish history this animal has witnessed. It stood in the aftermath of the famine, pulling turf and potatoes from soil where hunger still lingered. It laboured through the Land War and the War of Independence, carrying messages and goods down rebel roads. It outlasted the empires, watched free state flags rise, and then hauled goods through the lean post-war years, when fuel was dear and roads were poor. It was there when emigration tore families apart. It was there when men left for England and women carried babies to baptisms, with nothing but a shawl and a cow and a cob cart. It stood by as Ireland modernised, as machines arrived, and as memories faded. But the Irish Cob never asked for a memory. It just did the work, 6 days a week and a rest on a Sunday. A horse that never made a sound unless spoken to, and rarely made the news unless someone fell off it. And there's something profoundly Irish in that the most important horse in our history might be the one without any glory, the one without a name for much of its history, the one bred by need, not by nobility. It wasn't the general's horse or the hunter's pride. It was the horse of the poor, the landless, the travelling tinsmith and the thatcher. The kind of horse that stood steady while you tied a door onto the cart with a bit of twine. The kind of horse that knew its way to Mass and home again. In today's Ireland, filled with SUVs and regulations and a million ways to disconnect from the land, it's worth remembering, for most of our past, mobility, economy, and even community were built not on fuel or fibre optics, but on hooves. Hooves like those of the Irish Cob. And if you want to see one in motion, you still can, not just in show rings or glossy brochures, but on a country road in the last light of a fair day, with someone in the seat who still remembers how to drive a good one. I'm Liam Blake, and this is the History and Heritage Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can listen to more wherever you get your podcasts, and you can follow me on Instagram at Liam Blake Podcaster. Thanks for listening, and the next time you pass a cob standing tied at a farm gate, or pacing a back road with feathers on its feet and rhythm in its walk, spare a thought for the quiet strength it carries and the long history it remembers in every step.